Before we begin, today's episode contains discussions of homicide, pregnancy loss, the death of an unborn child, infidelity, decomposition and recovery of human remains, and other details that some listeners may find disturbing. We're going to avoid unnecessary graphic detail, but some information is important in understanding the investigation and the trial. If any of the subjects are difficult for you, please take care while listening. Because our podcast is literally called Don't Tell the Kids, this is probably one of those episodes we'd recommend listening to without little ears around. And before we get into the story, we want to tell you where our information comes from. For this episode, we've relied heavily on court records and opinions, including the California Supreme Court's opinion reviewing Scott Peterson's conviction and sentence, trial testimony, and publicly available court materials, law enforcement information, interviews, and public statements from Laci's family. Sharon Rocha's account of her daughter and the case, and established reporting from outlets including the Associated Press, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and other major news organizations. We've also reviewed later reporting surrounding Scott Peterson's appeals and post-conviction litigation. And that's especially important because this case is still discussed today. Scott Peterson has remained his innocence. His attorneys and supporters have challenged portions of the prosecution's case and have argued that evidence pointing toward alternative possibilities was not adequately considered. At the same time, Scott was convicted by a jury in 2004 of first-degree murder of Laci's death and second-degree murder on Connor's death. His death sentence was overturned in 2020 because of errors involving jury selection, not because his murder convictions were overturned. He subsequently resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. More recently, the Los Angeles Innocence Project became involved in his case and pursued additional post-conviction claims. In 2026, a judge denied his latest effort for relief. So when we reach those later developments, we'll explain both what Peterson's attorneys argue and what prosecutors and courts have concluded. Our goal isn't to tell you what to think, it's to separate three things as clearly as we can: what we know, what was argued, what remains disputed, and with that, let's meet Laci. Christmas Eve. For most families, those two words bring up a very specific feeling. The last-minute wrapping, food being prepared in the kitchen, kids asking how many hours are left until Christmas morning, family members calling to ask what time they should come over, and for anyone who has ever been pregnant during the holidays, maybe it's trying to get comfortable on the couch, while everyone tells you that next Christmas is going to look completely different, because there will be a baby. In December of 2002, that's exactly where Laci Peterson was in her life. She was 27 years old, 8 months pregnant. Her baby's nursery was waiting. His name had already been chosen. His name was Connor. And sometime around February, Laci was supposed to become a mom. Her parents were supposed to become grandparents. Her friends were supposed to meet this little baby boy they'd already heard so much about. There were baby clothes waiting to be worn, a crib waiting for a baby to sleep in, and an entire family waiting for the next chapter of their lives to begin. But on Christmas Eve morning, Laci Peterson disappeared. Within hours, her family was searching. Within days, strangers were searching. And eventually, an entire country would know her name. Before we talk about the trial that became one of the biggest media events in the early 2000s, we need to talk about Laci. Because before she became the center of one of America's most recognizable murder cases, she was someone's daughter, she was someone's friend, she was someone's best friend, and she was preparing to become someone's mom.
And that's something we're going to try very hard not to lose sight of today. Because when a case becomes this famous, sometimes the person at the center of it almost disappears underneath everything that comes afterward. The theories, the documentaries, the court proceedings, the arguments about evidence, the person convicted of the crime. 20 plus years later, people still debate the Scott Peterson case. But sometimes in all of that debate, Laci becomes almost secondary, and she shouldn't.
So today, we're going back to the beginning, not to Scott, but to Laci. Welcome to Don't Tell the Kids. I'm Samantha.
And I'm Paige.
We're two moms who wait until the kids are hopefully asleep.
Heavily emphasis on hopefully.
And then talk about the cases that keep us awake at night. But if you've listened to us before, you know that there's something we try to do differently here. We don't want to begin with how someone died. We want to begin with how they lived. Because these aren't characters, these are people. They had favorite foods, annoying habits, family traditions, people they called when something amazing happened, people they called when something terrible happened, and futures they expected to live. So, before we tell you what happened to Laci Peterson, we're going to introduce you to Laci. Laci Denise Rocha was born on May 4th, 1975. And when you listen to people who actually knew her talk about her, there's something that comes through almost immediately. Laci was social. She was warm. She liked people. She was the kind of person whose presence was felt in a room, and she was extremely close with her family. Her parents, Sharon and Dennis Rocha, divorced when Laci was young, and she grew up in California alongside her older brother, Brent. Her childhood wasn't remarkable because something terrible happened during it, and I actually think that that's really important. It was remarkable because it was normal. Her family, her school, her friends, the way she grew up, and figuring out who she was. The kinds of memories most of us don't realize are precious while we're making them.
And I think that's something that hits differently once you're a parent, because when your kids are little, you're constantly documenting everything. Their first steps, first day of school, birthdays, Christmas mornings. And then somewhere along the way, those memories become ordinary. You stop taking a picture every single morning. But those ordinary days eventually become someone's childhood. That's what Laci had, a whole life before anyone outside her community knew her name.
Laci eventually attended California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. She studied ornamental horticulture, and while she was there, she met Scott Peterson. Scott was also attending Cal Poly. Their relationship developed, and eventually the two married in 1997. From the outside, they appeared to be building the kind of life many young couples imagine. Marriage, careers, a home, eventually children. They settled in Modesto, California. Scott pursued business ventures, including operating a fertilizer-related business, while Laci worked and created a home that friends and family would later describe as being very important to her. She loved entertaining, decorating, and hosting, and eventually she very much wanted to become a mother.
That part matters because Laci and Scott didn't immediately have a baby. According to accounts from those close to them, becoming pregnant was something Laci had wanted for some time. So when she finally became pregnant in 2002, this simply wasn't another life event. It was something she had hoped for.
And they learned they were having a boy, and they chose a name. His name was Connor. There is something incredibly personal about naming a baby before they're born, because suddenly the future isn't abstract anymore. You're not imagining a baby, you're imagining your child. You picture where they'll sleep, what they'll look like, whether they'll have your eyes, whether they'll be stubborn like their dad, what Christmas will look like next year. And by December 2002, Laci was well into the future in her mind. Connor's due date was approaching. The nursery had been prepared. Family members were preparing to welcome him. Laci was visibly pregnant and nearing the final weeks of pregnancy. And Christmas was approaching.
Which makes what was happening privately inside the Peterson marriage especially important, because while Laci was preparing for their baby, Scott was having an affair.
Her name was Amber Frey. And one of the most important things to understand about Amber is this. When she began seeing Scott Peterson, she did not know he was married. She did not know Laci existed, and she did not know that the man's wife was 8 months pregnant. Scott presented himself to Amber as being available, and at one point before Laci disappeared, he told Amber something that would later become incredibly significant in this investigation. He told her that he had been married, but that he had lost his wife.
Before Laci was missing.
Yes, and that fact would eventually become one of the details that prosecutors emphasized on heavily. Because at that time Scott said it, Laci was still alive. She was pregnant, she was preparing for Christmas, and she had no idea that her husband was describing himself to another woman as someone who had lost his wife.
And this is where we have to be careful. Having an affair does not prove someone committed murder. Lying does not automatically prove murder. Being a terrible husband does not make someone a murderer. And the jury wasn't supposed to convict Scott because he cheated on Laci.
Exactly. This case was largely circumstantial. There wasn't one piece of evidence where investigators could point and say, there, that alone proves exactly what happened. Instead, prosecutors built their case through many pieces of evidence that they argued formed one larger picture. Scott's affair was only one piece. His lies were another. His behavior before and after Laci disappeared was another one. His movements were another. And eventually, the location where Laci and Connor were found would become one of the most important pieces of all. And none of that had happened yet. December 24th, 2002. Christmas Eve. For the Peterson family, this was supposed to be an ordinary holiday. There were plans, family expected to see them. Christmas was the next morning. And Laci was 8 months pregnant with Connor. She was approaching the final weeks of pregnancy she so badly wanted. There should have been very little remarkable about that morning. But by the end of the day, Laci would be missing, and almost immediately, investigators would begin trying to determine what had happened during a relatively small window of time.
And because this case has been discussed for more than 20 years, there are now so many theories surrounding that morning that it's easy to lose track of something really important. There are things we know. There are things Scott said happened. There are things witnesses believed they saw. And there are things prosecutors would later argue happened. Those aren't automatically the same thing.
Exactly. So we're going to start with what Scott told investigators. According to Scott, the morning began at their home in Covenant Avenue in Modesto, California. He said Laci was planning to walk their golden retriever, Mackenzie. There were also ordinary Christmas Eve tasks still happening. Scott said he planned to go to his warehouse and then spend part of the day fishing. Eventually, he left the house, and according to his account, Laci was alive when he left. And that brings us to the fishing trip. Scott drove to his warehouse in Modesto, and from there he took his recently purchased aluminum boat and headed toward Berkeley Marina. That wasn't a short drive. Berkeley is roughly 90 miles from Modesto, and Scott would later say he initially considered golfing but ultimately decided to fish instead. He launched the boat and went into San Francisco Bay. This detail would eventually become one of the most important facts in the entire case. But on December 24th, it was simply where Scott said he had spent his day.
And we need to keep reminding ourselves not to tell this story backward, because today we hear Berkeley Marina and immediately understand why it matters. Investigators didn't know that. At that moment, Laci hadn't even officially become the center of a massive missing person investigation. Scott was simply giving police his account of where he had been.
And back in the Peterson neighborhood, something happened that would later become the center of an enormous amount of debate. Mackenzie, the Petersons' dog, was found outside. He was wearing his leash. A neighbor, Karen Service, found him wandering and returned him to the Peterson property. At the time, she had no reason to believe she was doing anything more than helping a neighbor out. She didn't know that Laci would soon be reported missing. She didn't know people would eventually debate exactly what time she found Mackenzie. She didn't know her morning routine would become part of a murder trial, and she simply just put the dog back.
And that dog becomes incredibly important because Scott had said Laci planned to walk him. So the obvious question later becomes, why was Mackenzie outside alone with his leash attached?
Exactly, and that's where the competing timelines begins. Prosecutors would eventually argue that Laci never took the walk that Scott described. The defense would point to witnesses who reported seeing a pregnant woman walking a dog in the neighborhood that morning. We'll talk about the witnesses when we get to the evidence, but on Christmas Eve itself, nobody knew they were building a timeline. They were just living their morning. Scott eventually returned from Berkeley Marina. According to his statements when he arrived home, Laci wasn't there. Her vehicle was there, but Laci was not. Scott said he assumed she might be with her mother. So he showered, he washed the clothes he had been wearing, and eventually he began trying to determine where his wife was.
And again, some of those details would become significant later. The shower, the laundry, what Scott did first, what he did next. But at this moment, Laci's family didn't have the luxury of analyzing behavior. They were trying to answer one question: where is she?
Scott contacted Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, and when it became clear that Laci wasn't with her, the concern escalated quickly. This wasn't a woman who had simply forgotten to tell people where she was going. Laci was 8 months pregnant. It was Christmas Eve. She had plans with her family. Her belongings were still at home, and nobody could reach her.
This is the part of a missing person case that I think is almost impossible to understand unless you've lived through it, because there's a period where your brain is still trying to make everything normal. Maybe her phone died. Maybe she went somewhere unexpectedly. Maybe she lost track of time. Maybe someone picked her up. You keep reaching for the explanation that allows the day to return to normal.
And then enough time passes that those explanations stop working. Family members began calling one another, friends were contacted, people checked places Laci might have gone, and law enforcement became involved. Modesto police officers arrived at the Peterson home that evening. From the beginning, Laci's pregnancy made the situation especially concerning. This wasn't simply an adult who might have decided to leave for a while. She was nearing her due date. She had not contacted the people closest to her, and nothing about her disappearance fit what her family knew about her. Police began asking the basic questions that investigators ask in almost every missing person's case. When was Laci last seen? What was she wearing? Who had spoken with her? What were her plans? Was anything missing from the house? Had there been problems in the marriage? And where had Scott been? Scott told them about Berkeley Marina. He told them that he'd gone fishing, and investigators began documenting his account.
And something else happened very early. Police became interested in the boat.
Yes, Scott had purchased a small aluminum fishing boat earlier that month. Not everyone in his life knew that he had bought it. It was being stored at his warehouse. Investigators went there and examined the space. They also began looking into Scott's truck and other potential evidence connected to his movements that day. Again, none of this meant that police had solved the case. When someone's spouse disappears, the spouse is naturally one of the first people investigators need to understand thoroughly. Scott was the person who said that he had seen Laci in the morning, and his timeline mattered. And while police worked, Christmas Eve became Christmas morning. Except there was no Christmas. Not really. Not for Laci's family. Instead of opening presents and talking about how different the next Christmas would be with Connor, they were looking for Laci. Friends and family began organizing, flyers were being created, people searched the neighborhoods, volunteers started showing up, and the community responded quickly, and Laci's face began to appear everywhere.
And I can't imagine that shift. One day you're preparing for your daughter to have a baby, and hours later, you're printing her face onto a missing persons flyer.
Especially because at that point, hope was still very real. Nobody knew Laci was dead. Nobody knew where she was. Her family wasn't thinking about a murder trial. They were thinking about finding her. And because she was pregnant, every passing day and minute carried another layer of urgency. Connor's due date was quickly approaching. And in the days after Christmas, the search grew. Police used officers, search teams, boats, helicopters, dogs, volunteers. Tips began coming in. And as media coverage increased, so did the public interest. People reported possible sightings. Some believed that they had seen Laci walking Mackenzie on Christmas Eve morning. Others reported seeing a woman who resembled her in different places. Investigators had to evaluate every tip and determine whether it could actually be connected to Laci. And that's one of the realities of a nationally publicized missing person case. Most attention can produce valuable information, but it can also produce an overwhelming number of leads that had to be checked.
And once Laci's photograph was everywhere, people genuinely wanted to help. But memory is complicated. You see someone's picture on television and suddenly think, wait, did I see her? Was that yesterday? Was that the same coat? Was that the same dog? And investigators had to determine which memories can actually be verified.
Exactly. Those reported sightings would later become a major part of the defense argument. But during the initial search, there were leads among many. And investigators were also paying increasing attention to the San Francisco Bay, because that's where Scott said that he had been the day Laci disappeared. Search teams examined the area around Berkeley Marina and the Bay. That search location became public, and eventually it would become one of the most consequential facts in the entire case.
And there's another part of these early days that I think gets forgotten. Initially, members of Laci's family supported Scott.
They did, because why wouldn't they? At that point, they did not know about Amber Frey. They did not know the full extent of Scott's deception. They knew Scott as Laci's husband, Connor's father, a member of their family, and they were supposed to be searching for the same person. That's important because when people look backward and ask, How did they not know? That's because they weren't investigating Scott. They were looking for Laci. And trust doesn't disappear simply because something terrible happens. Usually it disappears when you learn something that destroys it. And for Laci's family, that information was coming. As Laci's disappearance received more media coverage, Amber Frey saw the news. And she learned something horrifying. The man that she'd been dating, the man who had presented himself as unmarried, was Scott Peterson, the husband of a missing woman, a woman who was 8 months pregnant.
And Amber could have disappeared at that point. She could have been terrified of the publicity. She could have decided this wasn't her problem. Instead, she contacted police.
And on December 30th, Amber spoke to the investigators. And what she told them immediately changed their understanding of Scott's private life. She explained their relationship. She explained that Scott had told her he wasn't married. She had told investigators about the statement Scott had made before Laci disappeared, that he had been married, but he had lost his wife. Now, investigators knew something Laci's family still didn't fully understand. Scott had been living 2 totally different lives, and they wanted to know why. Amber agreed to cooperate with the police. That included allowing investigators to record her telephone conversations with Scott. And those calls became extraordinary evidence because they captured Scott's lies as they were happening. He continued communicating with Amber while Laci was missing, and he continued lying about where he was and what he was doing in those moments.
Including one of the strangest examples in this entire case, the vigil.
Yes. On New Year's Eve, while hundreds of people gathered for a candlelight vigil for Laci, Scott spoke with Amber. And instead of telling her where he was, he claimed that he was traveling in Europe. He described being in Paris. He talked to her about the Eiffel Tower. Meanwhile, he was in California, and people were gathered hoping that she would still come home.
And this is where the emotional reaction is immediate, because you hear that and think, how could someone do that?
Absolutely. But as we said earlier, being a liar does not prove murder. Having an affair does not prove murder. The prosecution would eventually use those calls as part of a much larger circumstantial case. The defense would argue that Scott was doing what he'd been doing before Laci disappeared. He had been lying to maintain an affair, awful behavior, but according to the defense, not proof that he killed his wife, and that's the distinction the jury would eventually have to confront. So in January 2003, Amber publicly acknowledged that she had been involved with Scott, and the entire public perception of the case changed almost overnight. Until then, much of America had seen Scott primarily as the husband of a missing pregnant woman. Now they knew that he had been having an affair. They knew he'd lied to Amber about being married, and eventually they would learn that he told Amber before Laci vanished that he had lost his wife.
And once that information became public, there was almost no going back. People had opinions, strong ones.
Scott became the focus of enormous public scrutiny. Reporters followed him, legal analysts debated his behavior, every facial expression became something to interpret, every interview became evidence in the court of public opinion. But law enforcement couldn't arrest someone because the public found him suspicious. They still needed evidence, and Laci was still missing. For Laci's family, learning about Amber was absolutely devastating for reasons beyond just the investigation. They were now discovering that the marriage they thought they understood had contained a secret that nobody knew about. And they were learning it while Laci was missing. They couldn't ask her what she knew. They couldn't ask whether she had suspected anything. They had to absorb that betrayal while still searching for their daughter.
And that's another part that feels different once you're a parent. You want to fix things for your child. Even when they're adults, you want to call them and say, Mom, this happened. And you want to say, okay, come home, we'll figure it out. Laci's family never got that opportunity.
Instead, they waited. January passed, then February. And February carried its own particular cruelty because that's when Connor was supposed to arrive. The due date that once represented excitement came and went, and there was no baby. No Laci, and still no definitive answer of where she was. So the investigation continued. Searches continued in Modesto and around San Francisco Bay. Police examined Scott's movements, his warehouse, the boat, his phone records, his finances, his relationship with Amber, the timeline of Christmas Eve, the reported witness sightings, and the burglary that had occurred across the street from the Peterson home. Each piece generated questions. Some would eventually become prosecution evidence, others would become defense evidence, and some would remain debated more than 20 years later.
But the biggest question still hadn't been answered. Where were Laci and Connor?
And that's why I think it's important that we don't rush through these months, because for us, it's a transition between Christmas and April. For Laci's family, it was their life, day to day. Wake up, go to bed without an answer, wake up, and do it all over again. So then came April. Nearly 4 months had passed since Christmas Eve, and along the shoreline of San Francisco Bay, something was discovered. On April 13th, the remains of a male fetus were found near the Richmond shoreline, and the following day, the remains of an adult woman were discovered nearby. DNA testing could confirm their identities. It was Connor and Laci.
The search was over, but not in the way anyone had hoped.
And for investigators, the location immediately mattered, because Laci and Connor had been recovered along the shoreline of the same bay where Scott said that he had gone fishing on December 24th. That did not answer every question. It did not tell investigators exactly how Laci died. It did not establish every step of what happened inside the Peterson home. And it did not eliminate every argument the defense would eventually make. But it did change the case completely. Laci was no longer a missing person. This was now a homicide investigation, and investigators believed the evidence was pointing towards Scott. Within days, they were preparing to arrest him. But before the jury could decide whether Scott Peterson murdered his wife and unborn son, prosecutors would have to take dozens of individual pieces: the marina, the boat, the affair, the lies, the witness accounts, the physical evidence, Scott's behavior, and convinced 12 people that together they told one story. The investigators believed the evidence pointed towards Scott, and after Laci and Connor were identified, the case changed immediately.
Because this was no longer a missing person investigation. It was a homicide investigation.
And the police were looking at Scott. On April 18, 2003, investigators located him near San Diego, and the circumstances of his arrest would become another major part of the prosecution's portrayal of him. Scott had changed his appearance. His hair and facial hair had been altered. He had a significant amount of cash. He had multiple cell phones. He had identification belonging to family members and other belongings with him. He was also near the Mexican border. Prosecutors would later portray these circumstances as evidence that Scott was preparing to flee. The defense offered a different explanation. Scott's family lived in the San Diego area. They argued that his appearance had changed partly because he had become instantly recognizable from nonstop media coverage, and they disputed the idea that his belongings established an attempt to escape to Mexico. Again, same evidence, two interpretations.
And I think that's going to become the theme of the trial, because by this point, almost everyone in America seemed to have an opinion.
Absolutely. Scott Peterson was arrested. He was eventually charged with murdering Laci and Connor. And before a single juror heard opening statements, this case had already become a national spectacle. Television cameras followed nearly every development. Scott's affair was public. Amber Frey's identity was public. Details about his lies were everywhere. People who had never met Laci or Scott had already decided what they believed, and that created a huge problem for the justice system. The case would ultimately be moved from the Stanislaus County to San Mateo County because of concerns about finding an impartial jury. And when the trial finally began in 2004, prosecutors faced a challenge. They had a defendant they believed had murdered his pregnant wife. They had his affair. They had his lies. They had his fishing trip. They had Laci and Connor found near the area where he'd been fishing. They had evidence from the warehouse and the boat. They had recorded conversations, but they did not have a witness to the killing. They did not have a clearly established murder weapon, and they could not tell the jury with a certainty exactly how or precisely where Laci had been killed. The defense knew that. And Mark Giragas, Scott Peterson's attorney, was preparing to use those gaps to argue something very simple. Suspicion is not proof. Being unfaithful is not murder, lying is not murder, and if prosecutors wanted to take away Scott Peterson's freedom, they had to prove beyond reasonable doubt that he had been the person who killed Laci and Connor. That battle would unfold over months, and when the jury finally heard both sides, they would be asked to decide whether dozens of circumstantial pieces formed one unmistakable picture, or whether there was still too many unanswered questions to convict, and that's where the trial begins. By the time Scott Peterson went to trial in 2004, the case had already become one of the most recognizable murder cases in the country. The media coverage had been relentless. Laci's photograph was everywhere. Scott's lies had been dissected on television, and people had spent more than a year forming opinions about what they believed had actually happened. So before prosecutors could even begin presenting evidence, the court had to deal with a basic question. Could Scott receive a fair trial in Modesto? The case was eventually moved to San Mateo County, and from there the prosecution and defense presented two very different versions of the same evidence.
The prosecution's theory was that Scott had decided he wanted a life without the responsibilities of his marriage and impending fatherhood. They argued that his affair with Amber was part of that context, not proof by itself, not part of the motive they wanted jurors to consider. According to the prosecution, Scott planned Laci's murder in advance. They pointed to the boat he purchased shortly before Christmas Eve, the fact that many people close to him didn't know about it, his research related to the Berkeley Marina, and his trip to the bay on the morning Laci disappeared.
And the prosecution believed Laci was killed in or around the Peterson home sometime before Scott left for the marina, but they could not establish exactly where she had died. There wasn't one confirmed murder weapon, there wasn't a witness who saw the killing, and because of this condition of Laci's remains, the medical examiner couldn't identify one specific cause of death. So prosecutors built the case through circumstances. They argued that Scott transported Laci's body to the warehouse, placed her into the boat, drove to the Berkeley Marina, and took her into the bay. They believed the homemade cement anchor found with the boat was evidence of a larger plan. Prosecutors argued that Scott had made multiple anchors and used them to weigh Laci down. But again, those additional anchors were never recovered.
And that became one of the defense's strongest points. Mark Geragos argued that the prosecution had created a very specific story without having physical evidence to prove every step. No recovered additional anchors, no eyewitnesses seeing Scott move Laci, no witnesses at the marina reporting that they saw a body in the boat, no established blood evidence showing a violent killing in the house, and no confirmed cause of death. The defense's position was that Scott may have been an awful husband, but the state still had to prove he was a murderer.
The defense also returned to the witness sightings. Several people had reported seeing a pregnant woman walking a dog around the neighborhood after the time Scott said he left. Geragos argued that those sightings suggested Laci was still alive after Scott had gone to the marina. The prosecution challenged the reliability of those reports. Some had seen media coverage before coming forward, and investigators never established that any of those sightings was definitely Laci. So jurors had to decide how much weight to give them.
The burglary across the street also became part of the defense theory. The defense argued that Laci may have witnessed the burglary and encountered the people responsible. Investigators had looked into the men involved and concluded they were not connected to her disappearance, but Geragos argued that police became too focused on Scott too early and didn't sufficiently pursue alternative possibilities. That idea, tunnel vision, was central to the defense.
And then there was the marina. For the prosecution, the location where Laci and Scott were found was one of the strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence. Scott admitted being near Brooks Island on Christmas Eve. Months later, Laci and Connor were recovered from the shoreline of the same General Bay area. The prosecution argued that the odds of an unknown killer choosing that same area by coincidence were extremely difficult to accept. The defense said the marina location had been public knowledge for months.
Another heavily debated piece of evidence involved Scott's boat. The defense argued that the small aluminum boat was unstable and that placing a body over the side without capsizing would have been extremely difficult. The prosecution conducted demonstrations and presented testimony intended to show that it could be done. So once again, same evidence, two very different interpretations.
The dog scent evidence also became part of the trial. As we discussed earlier, the Berkeley Marina trailing evidence involving the dog Trimble was admitted. The handler testified the dog followed what she interpreted as Laci's scent toward the marina. The defense challenged the reliability of the scent source, the training, and the interpretation. Jurors were told that dog training evidence could not independently establish guilt. It was another supporting piece, not the entire case.
And then came Amber Frey. Her testimony was one of the most anticipated moments of the trial. By that point, the public already knew about the affair, but the jury was now hearing the details in a courtroom. Amber explained how Scott had presented himself as single, how the relationship developed, how he spent time with her daughter, how he had told her before Laci disappeared that he had already lost his wife.
Then the recorded calls were played. The jury heard Scott maintaining lies about where he was. He told Amber he was in Europe. He described Paris. He described New Year's Eve. Meanwhile, he was in California, and his missing wife's family was holding a vigil. The prosecution argued that those calls showed more than a simple adultery. They said that the calls reflected planning, deception, and emotional distance from Laci. The defense argued that they reflected a man desperately trying to conceal an affair, not a confession, and not proof of murder.
And I think this is a really important point. The prosecution did not ask the jury to convict Scott because Amber existed. They asked the jury to consider Amber alongside everything else. The statement before Laci disappeared, the secret boat, the marina, the lies, the recovery location, the later behavior, the arrest circumstances. It was the accumulation of all these details that prosecutors said mattered.
The prosecution also presented evidence about decisions Scott made after Laci disappeared. He sold Laci's vehicle. He discussed selling the house. There were questions about finances and business losses. Prosecutors argued that those actions suggested he did not expect Laci to return. The defense said that those decisions were being interpreted through the benefit of hindsight. The house had become surrounded by media. Practical decisions did not automatically reveal guilt.
Then there was the evidence from Scott's arrest. When he was taken into custody near San Diego, he had changed his appearance. He had a large amount of cash, multiple phones, identification belonging to family members, camping gear and clothing, and he was relatively close to the Mexican border. The prosecution called that evidence of flight. They argued that once Laci and Connor had been found, Scott knew the investigation was closing in. The defense said he was staying near family, avoiding media attention, and had legitimate explanations for the cash and belongings.
The entire trial became an exercise in asking one question over and over. What does this fact mean? And when you combine it with the next one, does that meaning change? Because one of the prosecution's strongest arguments was not that any single fact proved the case. It was that innocent explanations became harder to sustain once all the evidence was placed together. The defense's response was equally straightforward. A collection of suspicious circumstances is still not enough if reasonable alternatives remain.
And the defense emphasized everything the state still could not answer. They could not tell the jury exactly how Laci was killed. They could not show an eyewitness. They could not produce additional anchors. They could not prove the exact minute Laci died. They could not completely eliminate every reported sighting or alternative theory. For the defense, those were not minor gaps. Those were the heart of reasonable doubt.
The prosecution argued the opposite. They told jurors that murderers do not always leave behind perfect evidence. Bodies decompose, objects are lost, people lie, and a person can conceal a crime without leaving one obvious forensic answer. They asked jurors to look at the whole pattern. Scott tells another woman that he lost his wife before she disappears. He secretly buys a boat. He researches the marina. He goes there on Christmas Eve. His wife vanishes. He lies about the affair. Her remains and Connor's are found near the area where he said he had been fishing. He returns repeatedly to the bay during the search. When the remains are found, he is later arrested carrying cash, extra phones, identification, and supplies. The prosecution argued that coincidence could explain one fact, but not all of them.
Closing arguments finished, the jury began deliberating, and even then, the trial wasn't calm. There were problems inside the jury room. One juror was removed after improperly researching the case outside of court. Later, the foreperson was also replaced. Alternatives were seated, and deliberations had to restart. That created questions immediately. Was the jury divided? Were people feeling pressure? Did those removals affect the outcome? Those issues would later become part of Scott's appeals.
But on November 12, 2004, the jury announced that it had reached a verdict. For the murder of Laci Peterson, Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder, and for the death of Connor, he was found guilty of second-degree murder.
And the difference between those two verdicts matters. First-degree murder reflects the jury's conclusion that Laci's murder was deliberate and premeditated. The second-degree verdict for Connor reflected a different legal finding about the specific mental state connected to his death. It did not mean Connor's life mattered less. It meant the jury applied different legal elements to each count.
After the guilty verdicts, the case moved into the penalty phase. The jury had to decide whether Scott should receive the death penalty or life in prison without parole. Laci's family gave victim impact statements. They described what had been taken from them, the entire future that should have existed around them. The birthdays, the holidays, the first days of school, the family photos, the ordinary years that had been expected. And in December 2004, the jury recommended death. Scott Peterson was formally sentenced to death in March 2005. For many people watching at that time, that seemed like the end of the case, but legally, it wasn't. Because death sentences receive automatic appellate review, and years later California's highest court would make an important distinction. The murder convictions would remain, but the death sentence would not. That later legal history would reopen public debate about the case. When Scott Peterson was sentenced to death in 2005, it looked like the legal chapter had reached its conclusion. But in a death penalty case, sentencing is not necessarily the end. California law provides for automatic review of death judgments, and over the years, Scott's attorneys challenged both his conviction and his sentence. Then in 2020, the California Supreme Court issued one of the most important rulings in the case. The court affirmed Scott's convictions. That means the first-degree murder conviction for Laci remained in place. The second-degree murder conviction for Connor remained in place. The multiple murder special circumstance remained in place, but the death sentence was reversed.
And this is one of those legal details that gets misunderstood constantly. When people hear Scott Peterson's death sentence was overturned, it could sound like his murder convictions were overturned too. They weren't.
Exactly. The California Supreme Court found problems with how potential jurors were removed during the jury selection for the penalty phase. Prospective jurors had expressed opposition to the death penalty, but opposition to capital punishment alone does not automatically mean someone can serve on a death penalty jury. The legal question is whether that person can still follow the law and fairly consider both possible punishments. The court concluded that some jurors had been excused improperly, so the death judgment could not remain, but the court specifically affirmed the judgment as to Scott's guilt.
So legally, the message was basically, the jury selection process for deciding punishment had a serious problem. The murder convictions themselves did not get erased.
Right. Prosecutors then have to decide whether they wanted to pursue another death penalty proceeding. Ultimately, they did not. And in 2021, Scott was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Laci's murder, an additional sentence connected to Connor's death. So Scott remains incarcerated, and he continues to maintain that he is innocent. In January 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project filed motions seeking post-conviction discovery. Their involvement does not mean Scott had been declared innocent. It means that attorneys working on his behalf believe that there was evidence they wanted to re-examine, and that is part of the legal process. People who have been convicted still have the right to challenge their convictions through procedures allowed by law.
A major part of those claims returns us to something we talked about earlier, the burglary across the street.
Exactly. Scott's attorneys have continued arguing that evidence related to the burglary and other alternative suspect theories deserved greater attention. They have also challenged aspects of the scientific and forensic evidence used at trial. Their position is that jurors did not hear information that might have changed how they viewed the case. Prosecutors have continued to dispute these arguments and defend the conviction, and courts have repeatedly considered different portions of these claims. Most recently, in April 2026, a judge denied another attempt by Scott's attorneys to present new evidence in support of post-conviction relief. His attorneys indicated that they plan to appeal that ruling, and as of today, Scott Peterson remains convicted of murdering Laci and Connor.
And this is where true crime conversations can get messy really quickly, because someone hears the Innocence Project is involved, and suddenly online it becomes he's being exonerated, or new evidence proves he didn't do it, and that is not what has happened.
Exactly. At the same time, saying the conviction still stands does not mean people are allowed to examine the evidence critically. That's what appellate and post-conviction processes are for. Evidence can be retested, witnesses can be reconsidered, legal errors can be examined, science can change. And when legitimate questions exist, the justice system should have a process for reviewing them. But we also have to describe where it legally stands. Scott Peterson was convicted. Those convictions were affirmed. His death sentence was reversed because of jury selection errors. He was resentenced to life without parole, and his later efforts to overturn the convictions have not at this point succeeded.
And I think that's one reason this case continues to fascinate people more than 20 years later. There are pieces people still argue about: the witness sightings, the burglary, the dog evidence, the exact timeline, the fact that investigators couldn't determine exactly how Laci died.
And reasonable people can look at individual pieces of circumstantial evidence and debate how persuasive it is. But the jury did not receive one piece. They received the entire case. They received the affair, the statement that Scott had already lost his wife before Laci disappeared, the boat purchased shortly before Christmas Eve, the marina research, the fishing trip, the recovery location, the lies, the evidence from the warehouse, the calls with Amber, the behavior after Laci disappeared, and the circumstances surrounding his arrest. They considered the defense arguments too, and after hearing months of testimony, they unanimously convicted him.
But after spending so much time talking about Scott, I don't want his name to be the thing we leave people thinking about.
Neither do I, because if you strip away the trial, the documentaries, the appeals, the arguments, the headlines, this story began with Laci and with Connor. Laci was 27 years old. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. She studied ornamental horticulture because she loved plants and growing things. She enjoyed cooking, decorating, hosting people. She was known for being social and energetic. And by December 2002, so much of her attention was focused on becoming a mother. She had waited for that pregnancy. She had named her baby. She imagined him. And she was only weeks away from meeting him.
I think that's the part of this story that stays with me more than any piece of evidence. She was so close to the next chapter. She wasn't preparing for her life to end. She was preparing for it to become bigger.
Exactly. There should have been a hospital room. There should have been newborn photographs. There should have been sleepless nights, a first smile, a first birthday, Christmas mornings where Connor was tearing through wrapping paper, school photos, soccer games, graduation, and eventually, maybe Laci watching her own son become an adult. These moments never happened, not because Laci didn't plan for them, but because someone took that future away from her.
And we also want to say his name, Connor, because in legal documents he becomes the fetus, or the second count, or the unborn child. Those descriptions have legal purposes, but that's not how his family knew him.
He had a name, Connor Peterson. His family was waiting for him. His mother was carrying him. His grandparents were expecting to meet him. There were already hopes attached to a person that they hadn't even gotten to hold yet. That is a very particular kind of grief. You're grieving someone and also every version of who they might have become.
As moms, I think this is where this case becomes difficult in a different way. We spend our children's entire lives imagining futures for them, even when we know we're not supposed to.
Oh, absolutely. You look at this tiny baby and suddenly you're picturing kindergarten, then sports, graduation. Then you're wondering what they'll be like as adults.
And Laci had already started doing that. She was already a mother. She just hadn't met him face to face yet.
And I think that's why I never want Connor to become just another element of Scott Peterson's trial. The jury wasn't debating an abstract pregnancy. There was a family waiting for a little boy. There isn't one neat parenting lesson we can pull out of this case. There isn't a checklist that guarantees we'll always know when something is happening inside someone else's marriage. And I don't think we should pretend that there is.
Because hindsight makes us feel much more smarter than we actually are. It's easy to look backward at the affair, the lies, the boat, and ask how people didn't know, but they didn't know the ending.
Exactly. Laci's family knew Scott as part of their family. They had eaten meals with him, celebrated holidays with him, trusted him. And when Laci disappeared, many of them initially supported him because that was the information that they had. That isn't foolishness. That's what trust looks like before you know it has been betrayed.
I think what we can take from this case is something simpler. Stay connected, ask questions, listen when something feels off, support people without immediately judging them, and understand that sometimes the person we love may be hiding something because they're embarrassed, afraid, or still trying to understand it themselves.
And when someone is missing, show up for that family. Not only during the week, not only when the cameras are there. Grief outlives the news cycle. And before we leave tonight, we want to return to where we started. Not Scott Peterson, not Berkeley Marina, not the trial, but to Laci.
Laci Denise Rocha Peterson, born May 4th, 1975. A daughter, a sister, a friend, a woman who loved gardening, entertaining, and the people around her.
And Connor, the son she was preparing to meet, the grandson her family was preparing to hold, the little boy whose future already existed in the imaginations of the people who loved him.
We hope that when you hear their names, you remember more than a case.
The investigation may be over,
but their story deserves to be remembered.
Because before there was a case, they were someone's whole world. I'm Samantha.
And I'm Paige.
And this is Don't Tell the Kids.
Good night, everyone.